Hello there and welcome to Monday in Parliament. Coming up, after the latest accusations about the Prime Minister's handling of the pandemic and further questions about who footed his redecoration bill, opposition MPs reckon it's time for an inquiry.
To get to the bottom of this slick, grubby cabal in charge of the UK.
The government unveils what it calls a powerful new sanctions regime to combat global corruption.
It will prevent corrupt actors from using the UK as a haven for dirty money, while combating corruption around the world.
And calls for ministers to rethink plans to restrict the right to protest.
And let's not forget, because of the right to protest, women achieved the right to vote.
But first, the Cabinet Office Minister Michael Gove says he never heard the Prime Minister make alleged comments that he'd let the bodies pile high on the streets rather than impose a second lockdown. The accusation was made on the front page of the Daily Mail newspaper. Out campaigning in Wrexham ahead of national and local elections in May, Boris Johnson denied making the remarks, adding that lockdowns had worked. The latest bad headline came amid questions about the awarding of pandemic contracts, David Cameron's lobbying for Greensill and demands to know who paid for the redecoration of the Prime Minister's flat. The SNP's Alison Thewlis asked an urgent question and reeled off a long list of accusations.
From the contracts to the Health Secretary's pub landlord, to the cosy chamocracy of the Greensill Capital affair, to the casual text messages between the Prime Minister and Sir James Dyson promising to fix tax issues, apparently in exchange for ventilators we never even got. And now questions over the Prime Minister's funding for feathering his Downing Street nest. Mr Speaker, I wonder if the Minister will agree with me that this is a clear pattern of behaviour and it absolutely stinks.
She wanted a full, independent public inquiry.
To get to the bottom of this slick, grubby cabal in charge of the UK.
She raised the whole question of procurement of PPE. It is a fact, well attested, that less than 0.5% of the PPE procured did not meet the standards that we had set out. It is a fact that every single recommendation for the procurement of PPE went through an independent 8-stage process verified by independent civil servants. She raises the Greensill question. Of course, the truth is that all the efforts on behalf of that company in order to push the Treasury and others were rejected. She raises the issue of Sir James Dyson. She doesn't acknowledge the fact that Sir James spent millions of pounds of his own money in order to try to ensure that we had ventilators to save those on the front line. She doesn't mention that the ventilator challenge was investigated by the Public Accounts Committee, who said it was a model of public procurement. She doesn't mention the fact that the changes to the Prime Minister's flat were paid for by the Prime Minister himself.
There must be no bullying or harassment, no leaking, no misuse of taxpayers' money and no actual or perceived conflicts of interests. These words are from the Prime Minister's foreword to the Ministerial Code. I don't know whether he believed them when he wrote them, but he's certainly trampling all over them today. The Prime Minister is now corrupting the standards of public life expected in high office. And as he dodges questions and tries to cover up payments for the luxury refurbishment of his flat, feathering his own nest and possibly breaking the law through undeclared loans. Now, as for leaks, we are seeing the pipes burst with a sewage of allegations.
She turned to that story on the front page of the Daily Mail, stating that Boris Johnson had said, let the bodies pile high in their thousands rather than order a third lockdown.
This is a Prime Minister who would rather let the bodies pile high than act on scientific advice. Mr Speaker, they are not bodies, they are people, they are loved ones, and they are deeply missed. So can I ask the Minister to engage with the issues at hand? When will the government publish the register of ministers' financial interests? Who paid the invoices for the Prime Minister's flat refurbishment in the first place? And when were those funds repaid? And when will the review by the Cabinet Secretary into this fiasco be complete?
Michael Gove turned first to those questions about who paid for the refurbishment of the Downing Street flat.
Previous Prime Ministers have used taxpayers' money in order to refurbish number 10 Downing Street. In 1998 to 1999, in real terms, the then Prime Minister spent £73,000 in that year of taxpayers' money on refurbishing Downing Street. Between 2000 and 2001, £55,000. Then again, 2007, 2008, £35,000. All taxpayers' money. This Prime Minister has spent his own money on refurbishing Downing Street, and I think that is a distinction that the Honourable Lady should pay close attention to. The Honourable Lady also suggests that the government did not act on scientific advice in dealing with this pandemic. I hope she'll reflect on those words and recognise that is completely wrong. This government, as I pointed out, has initiated not just a second but a third lockdown in response to medical and to scientific advice.
Constituents are sick and tired of this endless tittle-tattle. They just want their lives to go back to normal, which is what this government is helping them achieve. They couldn't care less about the Prime Minister's cushions or his curtains. Minister, when will we have an opposition that cares about the actual priorities and not who the Downing Street decorators are?
Surely my right honourable friend agrees with me. The ridiculous situation here is why our Prime Minister should be paying anything at all personally, unlike other world leaders, when it is us, the taxpayer, who demands they live above the shop.
I read through the ministerial code this morning. It took me longer than most members because I'm slower. But I could see absolutely nothing in that that would make me think the Prime Minister's done anything wrong. So why don't we leave it to the system to investigate this matter, if there's a requirement for it, rather than dance to the tune of a media frenzy?
Concerns about the Prime Minister and the ministerial code are not tittle-tattle. If, as seems to be the case with our archaic and dysfunctional rules, it is the Prime Minister himself who decides whether the ministerial code has been broken, should we really be trusting this one to mark his own homework?
Other MPs returned to the handling of the pandemic.
Doesn't the Minister agree that the best way forward would be to get all the facts straight, an independent public inquiry into the government's handling of the pandemic, and will he urge the Prime Minister to go ahead with it without delay?
There will be time for an independent public inquiry, and there will be lessons to be learned. Mistakes have been made, but I think it's important that we concentrate now on making sure that our economy is restored to health, that public services get back to the level that they should be, and also that we deal with this virus once and for all.
An SNP MP asked again about that Daily Mail headline.
Today, we've had a number of sources state that the Prime Minister shouted in a rage that he would rather see the bodies piled high in their thousands than order a third lockdown. Does the Minister not accept that a Prime Minister who does not put public health first is no Prime Minister at all?
The Prime Minister made a decision in that meeting to trigger a second lockdown. He made a subsequent decision to trigger a third lockdown. This is a Prime Minister who was in a hospital himself, in intensive care. The idea that he would say any such thing, I find incredible. I was in that room. I never heard language of that kind.
Michael Gove said such decisions were never easy, but the Prime Minister had decided to have a second and third lockdown, which was evidence of Boris Johnson's leadership. Well, Michael Gove wasn't the only one being questioned about prime ministerial probity. Simon Case is the Cabinet Secretary, the man responsible for the efficient running of the government. He was appearing before MPs on the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. They began by asking about the inquiry into who leaked the government's plans for a second lockdown in November. Mr Case started as he meant to go on.
I hope the committee will understand I'm very constrained in what I can say given the security classification of the exercise of this leak inquiry. What I can say is the investigation is ongoing, and this is a clear indication that the source or sources haven't been identified. Given the time that has now passed, I think it's probable that the team will not successfully identify the source or sources, but work is ongoing.
The former Downing Street advisor Dominic Cummings has accused Boris Johnson of trying to stop the inquiry because it implicated a friend of his fiancée, Carrie Simons.
A suggestion was made that an inquiry be suspended in case it brought forward an answer that wasn't particularly helpful.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure what press report that is, but no. I mean, in relation to this particular leak or others, the Prime Minister's always been clear that I'm very determined to see these inquiries complete.
William Wragg couldn't understand why the inquiry was taking so long.
But surely very few people, or relatively few people, would have known about this subject matter in October, so it's a rather small pool in which to fish.
Mr. Chair, I'm not sort of trying to frustrate you or other members of the committee on this, but we're going here into the details of the investigation and who knew what, and this is an area where I'm constrained.
Yeah.
Then there was the question of how the financier, Lex Greensill, came to be working in Downing Street while David Cameron was Prime Minister.
I find it extraordinary that you come before this committee and not really knowing anything about the terms upon which Mr. Greensill managed to be installed in Downing Street, which members of the committee may find rather alarming.
Well, I mean, as Darren set out, I mean, the Prime Minister...
Mr. Case, if the committee is alarmed, are you alarmed by this?
Yes.
It was always clear that these appointments were unacceptable. Do you believe that then previous permanent secretaries and cabinet secretaries have dropped the ball and done things that were unacceptable or allowed unacceptable things to happen?
Look, there are things that happened under Greensill that we at the moment, we can't explain. That.
Mr. Case, you're the guardian of the propriety and ethics and civil service conduct in your role. Do you think it's acceptable that you come before this committee to discuss these matters, having been told that you can't discuss them? You're essentially pleading the fifth. Is that acceptable?
As I said, I can only apologise to...
No, that's okay. Thanks for your apology, but is it acceptable?
Well, yeah, I'm afraid it's necessary.
Simon Case there. Several senior Conservatives, including a former Prime Minister, have criticised the government's decision to cut overseas aid. Theresa May said the move would hit the world's poorest, while other Tory MPs said people would die as a result of the decision. The share of the UK's national income spent on development is being reduced, although ministers have said they'll reverse the cut when the economy recovers after the pandemic. A Conservative former International Development Secretary wanted answers.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the point 7 is not just a commitment to the world's poorest, enshrined in law by this House. It is a reflection of the kind of country we aspire to be and the values which we uphold. We are cutting £500 million in humanitarian aid. This will mean that 3 million women and children will not now receive life-saving support. Madam Deputy Speaker, is it not clear that the original estimate of 100,000 souls who will die as a result is now a tragic understatement? This dreadful political, not economic, decision shames our country and our government. Madam Deputy Speaker, it should shame us all.
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I completely understand the passion with which my right honourable friend speaks, but the simple truth is that the UK economy is 11.3% smaller than it was last year and is undergoing the worst economic contraction for 300 years. The coronavirus has set in place a unique set of circumstances to which we are forced to respond. And yet, despite these difficulties, despite this economic impact, the UK will remain, in both absolute terms and percentage terms, one of the largest ODA donor countries in the world.
Labour condemned the cut.
Make no mistake, slashing humanitarian support in the middle of a global pandemic is callous and incredibly short-sighted. People will lose their lives as a result of the cuts, and we will all be less safe. And as the only G7 nation to cut aid, it is a retreat from our moral duty and will weaken our position on the world stage.
The SNP said aid to the world's largest humanitarian disaster, Yemen, would be cut by 60%.
He shamefully hid behind the pitiful excuse of needing to make difficult decisions. Was it a difficult decision to use this money to deliver a windfall for the defence budget and increase spending on nuclear weapons? Or was it simply an ideological decision that everyone can see clearly through?
Announcing these deep, potentially unlawful aid cuts through a written statement was cowardly. But in the context of coronavirus, it's also incredibly short-sighted.
Theresa May joined the Tory chorus of disapproval.
The integrated review identifies the United Kingdom as a soft power superpower, citing as one of the reasons our contribution to international development. Exactly how is that position going to be enhanced? By the action of cutting aid to the world's poorest, including those in slavery. And I note slavery was not even referred to in the written statement issued by the Foreign Secretary last week.
I can assure her that she and I, and I'm, as I say, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary are as one, that we aspire to be a global leader in soft power and in development. And we will recover back up to 0.7% as soon as the fiscal situation allows.
The awful scenes that we're seeing in India are obviously having a deeply personal and human impact there, but for many here too. People are dying right now, and as we know from our experience, rising case numbers can only mean one thing. They can't breathe, Madam Deputy Speaker. So what more can we do through the Minister's good offices to export our vaccine miracle to our historical good friends in India who really need us right now?
I'm very proud of the fact the UK government has moved quickly to help supply oxygen-related technologies. We're also committed to making sure both the scientific breakthroughs that the teams at Oxford University have created alongside AstraZeneca will be shared globally around the world.
James Cleverly. You're watching Monday in Parliaments with me, Alicia McCarthy. Now, ministers have launched a new sanctions regime that will target corruption around the world. The government has banned 22 individuals from travelling to Britain and frozen their assets for their role in serious corruption around the world. The move was announced to MPs by the Foreign Secretary.
As with our global human rights sanctions approach, the anti-corruption sanctions are not intended to target whole countries or whole peoples, but rather to target the individuals who are responsible and should be held responsible for graft and the cronies who support or benefit from their corrupt actions. So these regulations today will enable us to impose asset freezes and travel bans on individuals and organisations who are involved in serious corruption.
Among those targeted are 14 Russians and business figures in South Africa, Sudan, Honduras, Nicaragua and Guatemala.
Corruption is not a victimless crime. Far from it. By enriching themselves, these people have caused untold damage, untold hardship on the countries and the communities which they exploited for their own predatory greed. So today we send a clear message. Those sanctioned today are not welcome in the UK. They will not be able to use British bank accounts or businesses to give their illicit actions some veneer of respectability because their assets will be frozen. And I can tell the House that more designations will follow in due course based on the policy note as well as the legal criteria that we've set out and assessed against the evidence.
We warmly welcome today's announcement. We agree that corruption is a global scourge. It costs the global economy billions every year. It sustains rotten governments, protects the dishonest and the criminal, tilts the playing field against businesses who do the right thing, and it denies people around the world money that belongs to them.
But she challenged Mr Raab over the UK's continuing relationship with Russia, China and Saudi Arabia.
On the one hand, he signals an intent to crack down on corruption and human rights abuses by causing economic pain to those responsible. But just down the road, those very same regimes can call up the Prime Minister to advance their own interests, even when those interests are at odds with the interests of the British people. He's used very strong words today, but while he is rightly pressing ahead with sanctions, he is either turning a blind eye to the real power relationships in government or he is being played. We deserve to know which it is.
While he has mentioned Russia, it would be good to hear him talk about those who are close to the Putin regime, directly assisting President Vladimir Putin in hiding hundreds of billions of pounds overseas. We know that there are many around the world who have used, sadly, our own markets and indeed other territories which are dependent upon us to hide wealth.
This is all happening against a backdrop of the Foreign and Development Office confirming it's cutting its own world-leading anti-corruption, open societies, media freedom and human rights work by over 50% this year. This is an abdication of responsibility that will allow for corruption and criminality to flourish.
He will know that we've got £10 billion this year that we have safeguarded, which leaves us remaining one of the global leaders in terms of aid. When we did the 7 priorities to safeguard and allocate in a strategic way, notwithstanding the temporary shift from 0.7 to 0.5% of GNI, one of the 7 priorities was open societies, and that includes our media freedom campaign.
Dominic Raab. The government's been defeated in the Lords on the Overseas Operations Bill after peers renewed their support for a measure placing a duty of care on the Ministry of Defence towards servicemen and women facing investigation or legal proceedings. The Lords first approved the proposal last month, but in the Commons last week, ministers removed it. With the bill back in the Lords, Lord Dannatt set about reinstating his plan.
The serving and veteran communities have been looking to this bill to provide better protection from repeated, extended and vexatious investigations and possible prosecutions following their service overseas on deployed operations. No one suggests for a moment that anyone is above the law. Indeed, soldiers only take up arms to protect the law. But this new bill, when it passes into law, singularly fails to provide the protection that serving and veteran members of the armed forces believe that it should provide. For this reason, my lords, the duty of care standard amendment has been tabled to improve this bill and enable it to achieve one of its original objectives.
The minister insisted that serving personnel and veterans were offered a wide range of support.
What I haven't heard is a detailed indication of where it is that the MOD is falling short. And I certainly feel that would be helpful to have a greater clarity about what it is that Noble Lords think to be the deficiencies of the MOD in this context.
But peers backed the measure by 312 votes to 243. The government did, however, offer a concession on another part of the bill, saying that war crimes would now be excluded from the presumption against prosecution. Finally, MPs have spoken out against government plans allowing police to put restrictions on some protests. Demonstrators have taken to the streets in recent weeks as part of a movement to kill the bill. They're objecting to the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which proposes giving police in England and Wales more power to impose conditions on non-violent protests, including those which are deemed too noisy or a nuisance. Ministers have defended the proposals, saying they're needed to tackle demonstrations, such as the ones by Extinction Rebellion in 2019, where mass occupations of roads and bridges stretched police resources to the limit. The debate was sparked by a petition signed by more than 100,000 people. A Conservative defended the government's position. He said the right to protest must be protected, but
in my view, the right to peaceful protest cannot, however, come at the expense of the rights of others. The rights of thousands of people to get to work, for an ambulance to get to a hospital, for a newspaper to be printed, or a public transport network to operate. There are loony lefty, walkie-talkie social media accounts out there that would have you believe the government were removing any meaningful right to protest. I'm sure those who took the time to look at the detail would be aware that's not the case. The right to protest remains rightfully protected, and the vast majority of protests and protesters will be entirely unaffected by these measures.
The problem with this bill is that it gives the police and the courts powers to decide what is acceptable, what is troublesome, what is annoying, what is too noisy.
Let's be absolutely clear. It is a blatant and biased attack on the long-standing right to protest from a government that has a track record of dismissing the rule of law, the truth, legal obligations and human rights as disposable inconveniences.
Because of the right to protest, we now have a moratorium on fracking. Because of the right to protest, the UK's anti-apartheid movement kept apartheid on the British political agenda. And let's not forget, because of the right to protest, women achieved the right to vote.
But the minister reckoned the bill had been misrepresented.
These measures have been portrayed by some to be draconian and a dismantling of our civil liberties. This is misinformed at best and misleading at worst. These measures simply seek to improve the balance of the rights of protesters with the rights of others, as I say, to go about their business unhindered, and will allow the police to take a more proactive approach in managing these disproportionately disruptive protests.
Kit Malthouse. And that's it from me for today, but I'll be back at the same time tomorrow with more of the news from Westminster. But for now, from me, Alicia McCarthy, goodbye.